The door was already open when Ozioma got there. Not open the way a door opens when someone forgets to lock it, open the way a door opens when nobody inside expects anyone to come. Tuminunu grabbed her arm in the corridor and whispered, "Don't make a sound." But Ozioma had already seen them. Her husband's hand on her mother's waist. Her mother's head tilted back, laughing at something only the two of them shared. The room smelled like the perfume Ozioma had gifted Celestine for her birthday. She stood there for 11 seconds. She counted, because counting was the only thing keeping her legs from giving out. Then she turned around, walked back down the corridor, took the elevator to the ground floor, sat in her car, and did not cry. Not yet. If you are new here, subscribe right now and turn on your notifications because this story is going to shake you to your core. Hit that like button and let's get into it. 6 months before that corridor, Ozioma was the kind of woman people noticed without understanding why. It was not just her beauty, though she was deeply beautiful, the kind of dark skin that glowed without effort, natural hair always pinned up when she was working, always loose and full when she wanted to feel like herself. It was the way she moved through a room, like she had already decided she belonged there. She had built her fashion studio in Abuja from nothing, from one sewing machine in a 2-room flat to a proper studio with 4 staff, a waiting list of clients, and her name printed on a glass door. She had done it herself, stitch by stitch, sacrifice by sacrifice, every late night and early morning bleeding into the fabric of something she was genuinely proud of. Randolph had come into her life the way good things sometimes do, quietly and without announcement. He was not the most handsome man she had ever met, but he was the most present. He listened when she spoke. He remembered small things. When she mentioned once in passing that she had stopped eating meat during a stressful project, he showed up 3 days later with a cooler full of vegetables she hadn't asked for. He said, "I just thought you could use options." She had looked at him standing in her doorway with that cooler and thought, "This is the kind of man I could build something real with." They dated for 2 years before he proposed. He did not do it in a restaurant or in front of a crowd. He did it on the balcony of her studio after everyone had gone home. Just the two of them, the Abuja skyline spread out in front of them, her fabric samples pinned to the wall behind them. He held the ring and said, "I don't want to do any of this without you." She had pulled him by the collar and kissed him so hard he nearly dropped it. Their early marriage was warm in a way that felt almost unfair. They argued, yes, but they also found their way back to each other quickly. Randolph was building his import business and Ozioma was growing her studio, and they moved through their days like two people who had agreed on the destination, even if they sometimes disagreed on the route. He would bring her food when she walked past 10. She would iron his shirts on Sunday evenings while he talked to her about whatever deal he was trying to close that week. They fell asleep mid-conversation more nights than either of them could count. It was Ozioma who suggested Celestine move in. Her father had died 14 months into their marriage, quietly in his sleep, the way good men sometimes go. And Celestine, who had always been a woman built around the structure of a household, began to dissolve without him. She called Ozioma every day, sometimes twice. The calls were not dramatic, but they were heavy, full of the specific sadness of someone who does not know what to do with their hands anymore. Ozioma mentioned it to Randolph one evening, and he said without hesitation, "Bring her. This house is big enough." She had kissed him for that, long and slow, the way she kissed him when she meant it most. She had pressed her forehead to his and said, "You are a good man, Randolph." He had smiled and said, "I'm trying." Celestine arrived on a Thursday with 3 large bags and a smile that felt like relief. She was 52 and still striking, the kind of woman who carried herself like she knew what she looked like. She settled into the guest room and within a week had reorganized the kitchen, taken over the cooking, and inserted herself into the daily rhythm of the house in a way that felt at first entirely natural. She would have dinner ready when they both came home. She would pour Randolph's evening drink without being asked because she had observed within days how he liked it. She told Ozioma, "I just want to be useful. I don't want to be a burden." She hugged her and said, "You are not a burden, Mommy. You are home." Tuminunu came to visit that first weekend and sat at the dining table watching Celestine move around the kitchen and said nothing until Celestine left the room. Then she looked at Ozioma and said very quietly, "Your mother dresses like she's going somewhere." Ozioma laughed and said, "She just likes to look nice." Tuminunu picked up her glass and said, just that, But her eyes said something her mouth had decided to leave for later. Ozioma did not notice the shift at first because she was busy. The studio had just taken on its biggest contract yet, a bridal collection for a Lagos socialite with opinions about everything. She was leaving the house early and coming back late, and in between she was on calls, in fittings, managing suppliers, managing her staff's feelings, managing everything. So she was not in the room for much of what was beginning. But it was beginning. It started with laughter. Not the warm, inclusive laughter of a full household, the other kind, the kind that stops just before you walk into a room. Ozioma came home one Tuesday evening to find Randolph and Celestine at the kitchen counter, close together, Celestine showing him something on her phone. They both looked up when she entered. Randolph straightened. Celestine put the phone face down on the counter. "Welcome, baby," Randolph said and kissed her cheek, but the kiss landed on the edge of her face, the way a kiss lands when the mind is already somewhere else. She told herself it was nothing. A week later, she walked into the living room and found them watching a film together, the lights low, a bowl of groundnuts between them on the cushion. She stood in the doorway for a moment and neither of them noticed her standing there. That was the thing that sat wrong. It was not what they were doing, it was how completely they had disappeared into each other's company that her presence had to announce itself. She said, "What are you watching?" And Celestine said, "Come and join us." And Randolph said, "It just started," but he did not shift to make space for her between them. He shifted toward the armrest instead, and Celestine was suddenly very focused on the television, and Ozioma watched a film she did not follow for 40 minutes. That night in bed, she said, "Randolph." He said, She said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm tired, Ozzy." She lay there in the dark staring at the ceiling and told herself that tired was just tired. Tuminunu called her on that following Saturday and said, "I'm coming over." Ozioma said, "Today is not a good," and Tuminunu said, "I'm already in an Uber," and ended the call. Tuminunu arrived with 2 bottles of juice, sat at the dining table, looked at Ozioma for a long time and said, "Talk to me." Ozioma said, "There is nothing to," and then stopped, because when she tried to say it, she couldn't. She sat down across from her oldest friend and said very quietly, "Something is wrong in this house and I don't know how to name it." Tuminunu nodded slowly. She said, "I need to tell you something and I need you to hear it without getting upset at me." Ozioma looked at her.
Tuminunu said, "I have been watching your mother since she moved in. Not because I was looking for something, but because something kept making me look. The way she touches his arm when she agrees with something he says. The way she laughs at everything he says, even the things that aren't funny. The way she sits in this house, Ozioma. She doesn't sit like a guest. She doesn't sit like a mother. She sits like..." Tuminunu stopped. Then she said it. "She sits like a woman who has decided something." Ozioma felt something cold run through her chest. She said, "That's my mother." Tuminunu said, "I know who she is." Ozioma said, "You are saying something you cannot take back." Tuminunu said, "I know." And the fact that Tuminunu did not backpedal, did not soften it, did not laugh and say she was overthinking was what broke through Ozioma's resistance. Before they could go further, Celestine walked into the dining room, saw the two of them and smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. She said, "Tuminunu, you didn't tell me you were coming." Tuminunu said, "I didn't know I needed to." The air between them went very still. Celestine looked at Ozioma and said, "Your husband called. He said to tell you he'll be home late tonight. He has a dinner meeting." Ozioma said, "He didn't text me." Celestine said, "He called the house phone," and turned and walked back to the kitchen. Ozioma looked at Tuminunu. Tuminunu looked at Ozioma. The house phone had not rung once in the last 4 months. Tuminunu pulled a folded paper from her bag and placed it on the table between them. She said, "A friend of mine saw them last week at this hotel. He didn't think much of it because he didn't know what was going on, but he mentioned it to me this morning." Ozioma looked at the paper. She did not touch it. Tuminunu said, "I need you to come with me tonight." Ozioma said Tumininu, and Tumininu said, if I'm wrong, I'll get on my knees and beg your forgiveness, but if I'm right, you deserve to know. They went at 9:30. Tumininu drove. Ozioma sat with her hands flat on her thighs the entire way, not speaking. When they got to the hotel lobby, Tumininu said, 3rd floor. My contact said they always go to the bar first. If they are here, they will come through this corridor. And then they waited. They did not wait long. The elevator opened at 9:52 and Randolph walked out first, his jacket over his arm, relaxed in the way a man is relaxed when he believes he is invisible. Celestine was beside him, close, her hand through his arm, her head tilting toward him as she said something that made him smile. He put his hand briefly over hers, not the way a son-in-law holds a mother-in-law's arm in a crowded place, the other way, the way that meant something. Ozioma did not move. She stood at the edge of the corridor and watched them pass 15 feet in front of her, and neither of them saw her. They were too absorbed in whatever world they had been building together in secret. She watched them turn the corner toward the hotel restaurant, and she felt something she had never felt before. Something that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but lived somewhere between the two, in a place so quiet it was almost peaceful. Tumininu grabbed her arm. Ozioma said, let me go. Her voice came out very calm, very clean, like something scraped down to the bone. They were back home by 11. Randolph's car was in the compound. He had beaten them back. He was in the sitting room when she walked in, jacket now hanging on the chair, television on, the picture of a man at the end of an ordinary evening. He looked up. He saw her face. He said, Ozzy, and she said, don't. She walked to the foot of the stairs and called up loud and clear, Celestine? A pause, then footsteps, then Celestine appeared at the top of the stairs, her wrapper tied at her chest, her face arranged into something cautious. Ozioma looked at both of them and said, tell me. Not a question, a door she was opening and giving them the chance to walk through. Randolph stood up. He opened his mouth, he closed it, and then, because the world is sometimes unbearably honest, Celestine said from the top of the stairs, very quietly, Ozioma, I'm pregnant. The room did not shake, the walls did not fall, nothing cinematic happened at all. Ozioma just stood there, and in the silence that followed, something she had spent 6 years building, trust, warmth, a life with corners she had loved, dissolved completely. Don't go anywhere. Like this video right now because what happens next will stay with you. Keep watching. She did not sleep in that house again. She packed one bag, the practical kind, essentials only, the way a woman packs when she has decided to survive rather than negotiate. She did not cry in front of them. She did not raise her voice. Randolph followed her up the stairs saying, Ozzy, please, just let me explain. And she said without turning around, there's nothing to explain, Randolph. She's your mother-in-law and she's carrying your child. I understand everything. He grabbed her arm at the bedroom door, and she looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and something in her expression made him let go. She drove herself to a hotel on the other side of town. She paid for 3 nights with her own card, went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and finally let herself feel it. Not loudly. She was not a loud griever. She sat very still and let the weight of it move through her. Her husband's hand over her mother's hand in that hotel corridor, her mother's voice coming down the stairs with the most devastating sentence anyone had ever spoken to her. The years of cooking and ironing and late-night conversations and the slow, silent erosion of something she had believed was permanent. She sat with all of it, and then she picked up her sketchbook from her bag because her hands needed something to do, and she started drawing. That was where Bartholomew found her at past midnight in the hotel lobby because the room had felt too closed in and she had come downstairs for air. She was at a corner table with her sketchbook, a cold cup of tea beside her, drawing the kind of lines a person draws when they are not thinking about art but about survival. He sat at the table next to hers and asked the waiter for coffee. Then he glanced over at her sketchbook and said, not intrusively, just conversationally, "Is that a sleeve?" She looked up. He was tall with a calm face, the kind of face that did not perform anything. She said, a bodice actually. He said, I should have known, I'm an architect, we always think everything is structural. And she laughed, just a small one, the kind that surprises you when you didn't think you had one left. His name was Bartholomew. He was in Abuja for a project and had been staying at the hotel for 2 weeks. He did not ask her why she was in a hotel or why she was alone at midnight. He talked about the building he was designing, about how his client kept changing the brief, about how he once designed an entire wing of a hospital around a window view that the client later wanted to brick up. She listened and felt strangely like a person again, like someone who existed outside of betrayal and pain, like someone who could still have a conversation that had nothing to do with what had just happened to her. They talked for an hour and a half. When she finally stood to go back upstairs, he said, I hope you sleep well. Just that. No attempt to extend it, no push for his number, no performance. She walked back to her room thinking that she had forgotten what it felt like to be in the presence of someone who did not want something from her. Meanwhile, the house on the other side of town was rotting from the inside. The scandal moved the way scandals always move, first in whispers, then in full sentences. A neighbor had seen Ozioma leave in the middle of the night with a bag. Someone who worked with Randolph had heard something from someone who heard it from someone else.
By the end of that first week, the story had circulated enough that Randolph's business partner called to ask if everything was all right. And Randolph had said yes, and known from the silence that followed that the answer was unconvincing. Meetings he had been confirmed for were quietly rescheduled. Invitations stopped coming. Men who had called him regularly became suddenly, mysteriously unavailable. Celestine lost the baby in the 6th week. Stress, the doctor said, though she had known before the doctor said it that her body was simply refusing a future it had no peace to grow in. She sat in the hospital alone because Randolph had been at a meeting he could not cancel, and she understood in that waiting room with the antiseptic smell and the fluorescent lights that she had destroyed her daughter's marriage for a man who could not even sit beside her when her body was in crisis. She went home and ironed the clothes of the woman next door for 2,000 naira because Randolph had not replenished the house account in 2 weeks, and she did not know how to ask him why. She had walked into this situation like a woman who had calculated everything and discovered too late that she had calculated nothing at all. Randolph moved out 3 months later, not dramatically. Just one evening, he put 4 boxes in his car and said, I'll send for the rest. And Celestine stood at the gate watching him drive away and understood that this was what it looked like when a choice reveals its full cost. He moved into a flat on the other side of Abuja. It was a fine flat because he still had some money, but it was the kind of fine that does not comfort anyone. He sat in it on evenings and scrolled through his phone to old photographs and did not call anyone because there was no one left to call who would not remind him with their tone or their silence of what he had done. He was not a man who cried easily, but he sat in that flat one night with the photograph of Ozioma at their wedding, her face turned toward him mid-laugh, completely unguarded, completely trusting. And he stayed with it for a long time. Ozioma reopened her studio 4 months after the night she left. Tuminu was there when the glass door swung open on the first morning, standing with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said everything without saying anything. The studio was rebranded, the name redesigned, the interior freshened. She had used the quiet to redesign every corner of it, the same way she had used the quiet to redesign herself. She was not the same woman who had stood at that hotel corridor counting seconds. She was something sharper now, something forged. Bartholomew had stayed in contact, not intrusively, not with pressure. A message here, a phone call there,
a conversation that picked up wherever the last one had left off. He had returned to Lagos for his project, but he visited Abuja when he could. And when he was there, he showed up at the studio with food she didn't ask for because he had paid attention, the same way Randolph had paid attention in the beginning, except that Bartholomew had not stopped. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday morning. Ozioma signed the papers in a lawyer's office, walked out into the Abuja afternoon, called Tuminu and said, "It's done." Tuminu said, "How do you feel?" Ozioma stood on the pavement for a moment, the sun on her face, the city noise around her, and said, "Free. I feel completely free." The night of her biggest showcase, 6 months later, the studio's bridal collection was displayed in a hall full of people who had come because her name now meant something. Bartholomew sat in the front row. Afterwards, when the hall had emptied and her staff were packing down and Tuminu was finishing the last of the chin-chin, he came and stood beside her, looking at the empty runway and said, "I've been trying to find the right time for this, but I realize there's no right time, there's just time." He turned to face her. He said, "I'm not asking you to forget anything you've been through. I'm just asking you to let me be part of where you are going." He held her hand. She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that moves through everything, past the careful parts, straight to the center of a thing. Then she pulled him close and kissed him, slow and setting, both hands against his chest, the kind of kiss that does not ask permission because it has already decided. At the back of the hall, near the exit, Randolph stood alone. He had not been invited. He had seen the flyer and come anyway, telling himself he only wanted to see that she was okay. She was better than okay. She moved through the remaining guests with Bartholomew beside her, her laugh full and unguarded, her face completely at peace. Randolph watched for 3 minutes, then he walked back out into the night and did not look back. Ozioma stepped out onto the studio rooftop later that evening, Bartholomew's hand in hers, the Abuja skyline open and wide and indifferent in the way that cities are, the kind of indifference that is actually a kind of freedom. She thought about the corridor. She thought about the 11 seconds she had stood there counting. She thought about her mother's voice coming down the stairs. She did not push the thoughts away. She let them pass through her the way painful things pass when you have finally stopped fighting them. She looked at Bartholomew. He was looking at the skyline. He turned and caught her looking at him and smiled, quiet and steady, the same way he had been since the beginning. She squeezed his hand once. That was enough. If this story moved you, drop a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story. We'll see you in the next one.